This is the same as Moloch, and Moloch was probably the same as the Minotaur, but Moloch came first. So we're talking about the people that worship this bull god that influenced the pre-Greeks. So interesting, right? So here's the commonality between these deities, as both of them had a taste for human blood, according to this editorial team. And so they both required human sacrifice. So we do know that the Minoans practiced human sacrifice. They had this once a year festival, and they took youth, kind of like the Hunger Games. You'd have to give up some youth for this thing that they did. And then, and this is archaeologically proven on the island of Crete, which was covered by a volcano, so they dug and found all this. And then the same for Baal in Tyre and Sidon and the Phoenician territories. Baal often required a human sacrifice. So these people of Canaan, Tyre and Sidon, were worshipers of Baal, so that means they also participated in human sacrifice. Only these people often sacrificed very small children. So, and that has been proven in Carthage. They found the remains of all these baby boys that were sacrificed in the name of their god. So this is all archaeologically proven stuff here. And interesting when you look at it, and really sad. So here in the North Kingdom, we have the people who are supposed to be the children of Israel serving the most hideous gods. And it says that God was very angry. And then they're very wealthy, and so they have a lot of power because they're port cities. And so Jezebel was known for her devotion to Baal and Ashtoreth. Ashtoreth is like the female counterpart of Baal, and they were both part of what's called the fertility cult. So they believed if you worship these idols, your land would prosper, but so would your family. And so they had terrible practices with temple prostitutes and just awful things that they did in the name of these fertility cults. And Ashtoreth was often displayed as a obscene woman, or often they just would worship her near trees, or they would set these poles up called Asherah poles, and they would worship her. And there was so much immorality related to the worship of these gods. It was just disgusting. And so sadly, the northern kingdom fell prey to all of that awful stuff. But here's the thing about it. They were so bad that Jezebel had 450 prophets of Baal that she supported, like at her table. She fed them. If these were her priests, prophets, she fed them, she clothed them, she housed them. 450 prophets of Baal and 400 of Asherah. So that's almost, can you imagine the king's table and the king's entourage, 1,000 people that they have to feed because she worships these false gods? She is dedicated to them. Dedicated, 850 people dedicated to them. So all the money, so much of the money coming into the palace, imagine with the taxes where they were rich, but coming in just to provide for these priests that served her God. So a weird situation going on. And things went so wrong at this time that somebody in the northern kingdom actually went and rebuilt Jericho. And if you remember back in Joshua, what did God say about rebuilding Jericho? He said, don't rebuild it. In fact, he said in Jericho, in Joshua 6:26, he said, if you rebuild this town, any man that will lay down the foundation with his oldest son and set the gates up with the death of his youngest. So they recorded in this book, in the Kings, I think it's the Kings, that 1 Kings 17, that a man by the name of Hiel either didn't know the curse or he didn't care, didn't think God was real. So he rebuilt the city, and his oldest son, Abiram, was killed when he put down the foundation, and his youngest son, Zegub, died when he put the gates in. That's in the Bible in that weird place, just to show you. It's just thrown in there just to show you they were not listening to God at all. They were not paying attention. They did not care. And so God gave them over to judgment. But here's the thing that you should always remember. We always have to remember God loves everybody, even these wicked people. So what he does in this situation is he sends a warning. He sends somebody to send a warning. And so he wants to send the warning before he brings his judgment. So he's going to bring the judgment, but he has to send the warning. So he sends the warning in this time through a prophet. And there are many prophets, but some that stand out. And at this particular time, a very important prophet stood out, and his name was Elijah. I really like Elijah, but he had a very hard life, very hard life. But he became sort of the mouthpiece of God. And he's supposed to go announce to Ahab that there's going to be no rain on the land until he says so. So then he runs, and then he hides. He hides out. So he gives the word, and then he hides. And as you read the scripture, you get the idea that everybody's looking for him, but nobody could find him. And you know where he went? God sent him clear over to the coastal city of Sidon. And he's clear over there. So nobody thinks he's in Sidon, because that's that evil city up north by the coast. So he goes there. Before he gets there, the land starts to go dry. And he is all by himself, and God feeds him by the ravens bring him food. He has no food. So the ravens feed him, and then it says he sets him down by a brook. So what's interesting about this is that God is always, even though his life is really rough, God always provides for him in miraculous ways. So then it says the brook dries up because the rain stopped. And so then he proceeds on to Sidon, and he sees this widow out gathering sticks. And he's by this time really thirsty, and he asks the woman for a drink of water. And she turns to go into her house to get a drink of water. And as she's going in, he says, and by the way, can I have a piece of bread? And she turns around to him and she says, sir, she said, I am going in. I have only a tiny bit of flour, and I have only a tiny bit of oil. I'm gathering these sticks to build a fire. I'm going to cook our last piece of bread because we're going to die. This is our last meal. And he said, if you will share that meal with me, your oil will never run out, and your flour will never end until the rain comes back and the crops grow. And so she just trusts what he says, and she goes in and she makes the bread, and she brings it out and shares it with him, and sure enough, her oil and her flour never ran out. And so he kind of hangs around and stays by her. It kind of acts like they have plenty of food, that they're taken care of. But at some point, that boy gets really sick, and he dies. And then, so remember, she's living in Sidon where everyone worships Baal. And so I'm sure people were saying, you're hanging out with that prophet, you're going to bring a curse upon us. I mean, you could just see what's happening to her. She's like, that prophet's here. He's from the prophet of Yahweh. If you feed him, Baal will bring a curse on you. So you can just see that happening to her. And she's like, hey, the oil, it like never ran out. Shut up, right? But then her son dies. And she starts to mourn. She's like, what kind of evil have you brought upon me? That my son is dying, that my son died. And Elijah takes the boy, and he goes upstairs, and he like lays over the boy and prays for him like 3 times. God, why would you hurt this boy? And please bring it back. It's all this widow has, because back then, there was no welfare. There was nobody to help you. All you had is your children, and she's a widow, and all she has is this one boy. So if he dies, she's dead. She's got nothing. And here she's been a kind person. She's helped him. So Elijah just 3 times begs over the body of this boy, and the boy comes back to life. And he brings it down to the woman, and she rejoices. Now you think, why did God let that happen? Because that was a trauma, right? Why did he even let that happen to that poor boy? Why go through that? But you know what he was trying to show? He was trying to show that there is no God besides the real God, and Baal is nothing. Baal has no power over you. And they were over by Sidon, where the word would have traveled around. The God of Yahweh, the prophet of Yahweh, healed someone and provided. This widow is like blessed because she took this prophet into her house. My goodness, unbelievable. So the word would have spread all around in that wicked city about the God, the real God. So God's just like prepping that area for a revival, because God never gives up on his people. He's constantly sending word and a warning and all of those things. So that is a real blessing. Finally, God says to Elijah, okay, you got to go back and you got to go see Ahab. On the way back, there's been a famine for like 3 years. Ahab has a man in his palace called Obadiah. Now, Obadiah is a God-fearing man. He's probably the only one in the palace, but he's a good guy. And secretly, without anyone knowing, Obadiah has been hiding in the cliffs anyone who served God. And so he hid 100 people from Jezebel. And he kind of stays in the palace, and he's totally trusted. He's in charge of the palace, and so no one knows that he's hiding these people. So he and Ahab decide they need to go out, and this is how destitute they are. They're going out to find grass to feed their horses before their horses die. So like they have all these horses, and they're gonna die if they don't get them some grass. So Ahab said, you go that way, and I'll go this way. And Obadiah, being a man of God, he runs into Elijah on his way to see Ahab. And Elijah says, go tell Ahab I'm coming to him, to talk to him. And this guy, Obadiah, is like, you will kill me. Everyone everywhere has been looking for you. And if I tell him you're coming and you don't show up, I am a dead man. I am like dead. So don't play games with me. I need to know that if I go tell him, you are going to be like right behind me, because his wrath will not spare my life. I'll be dead. And Elijah's like, I give you my word, I will be there. God has sent me to him. And so he also tells Elijah how Jezebel has been killing all the prophets of God. And so there's still a few in the land. There's still a few people, stragglers up in the north land, trying to do the work of God. And she just has been going through on a rampage and killing anybody that isn't one of her priests or one of the worshipers of her Baal and her Asherah. So Elijah promises to appear. So Ahab goes out to meet him, because Obadiah tells him where he is. And this is what Ahab has the audacity to say. Is it really you, you troublemaker of Israel? And that's 1 Kings 18:16. Do you believe that? Isn't that funny how people who are wicked just blame everybody else? I just think that's really interesting. The people that cause all the problems are the quickest to blame other people for the problem. He says, is it really you, you troublemaker of Israel? And then Elijah responds, I have been no trouble, but you and your Baal-worshipping family have been the trouble. So he tells him that. So he says to him basically, my words, my paraphrasing, let's have a showdown. Let's have a big showdown. Why don't you meet me on Mount Carmel? You bring all the priests of Baal and Asherah in the morning, and we'll show up, and we're going to have a showdown, and we'll just get all the people together. And so all of the 850 priests show up in the morning, and Elijah's like, okay, people, you got a choice. You're going to serve Baal, you're going to serve God. And they don't say anything. They're just looking. Like, we don't know. So he says, okay, well, let's figure it out. So he says, Baal, why don't you guys, here's 2 bulls. We're going to make 2 altars. You make an altar. You know, Baal's the god of fire. He's the god in charge of all the gods. So let's make an altar. Here's the sacrifice. Here's your altar. You got 850 priests. Once you call down fire on your altar, I'll let you go first. And if your God is real at all, he'll be able to bring fire on your altar. He's the God of fire after all. And so they start out, doing their chanting and calling out for this God to come start the fire on the altar. And by noon, nothing's happened. So then Elijah kind of starts to tease him a little bit. And he's like, so, maybe you should yell louder. Or maybe your God's asleep. Or maybe he's literally in the Bible. Maybe he's going to the bathroom, but he's not hearing you right now. So he's kind of taunting, kind of trash talking them a little bit, kind of showing to the people that these guys have no power at all. So remember I told you that Baal and the Minotaur have a lust for human blood, right? That's the common thing. So then they start cutting themselves. And they're like bleeding. And the Bible uses the word gushing. They're bleeding everywhere. And they're calling out to their gods. Oh, gods, come and start the fire. You're the great Baal. On and on and on and on. And they're just gushing. There's probably blood everywhere. And imagine 850 people doing this. And it had to have been loud and messy and awful. So then finally Elijah says, people, come over here. Come over here. Because that would have taken a lot of people. They would have been watching. He's like, come over here to my altar. And he takes 12 stones, like the 12 tribes of Israel, and he takes that bowl and puts it up on the altar, and he digs a trench around the altar, and he says, fill 4 huge jars with water and pour it over the altar. So they did. And then he said, do it again. So they pour it over. It's running in the trench. It's everywhere. He says, do it one more time. Pours the water, running everywhere. Everything's wet. Everyone knows there's no way the fire is going to start on that altar. And then he just prays to God. He says, show yourself to these people. And he says, show yourself to these people. And the fire comes down, hits the altar, licks up all the water, and it's crazy. And the people just start shouting to God, this really is God. This God is God. I can't believe it. This God is amazing. So he's so excited, and all the people are like, so Elijah has like a mountaintop experience where this is it. We're all going to turn back to God. It's over. And he gives the order, go kill all the evil prophets. No question. The people take after him, destroy all the prophets. Ahab himself seems excited. So he tells Ahab, okay, now Ahab, I want you to go eat because it's going to rain. It's going to rain so hard that your chariot is not going to get back to Jezreel if you don't eat now. You go eat. And this is what's miraculous. It said God gave him strength. And Elijah ran, it's like 30 miles. He ran in front of that chariot all the way to Jezreel and just praising God. And then they ran, and then the rain just came down. And it came down. And everyone's so excited. And Ahab is so excited, and he runs in and tells his wife, Jezebel, you won't believe what just happened. And I'm sure, I don't know, it doesn't say, it just tells him, it just says in the Bible, he tells her everything. So, and who knows how, but he was like, you wouldn't believe what just happened. And then he's like, and all the priests are dead, and they killed all the priests, and it was this like amazing thing. And here's what's interesting, she must have just kept quiet and not said anything, because it said, she's pretty devious. So she sends a note. She doesn't yell, I'm going to kill him, or at least we don't know she does. She writes this note and gives it to one of her messengers and says, take this note and take it to Elijah. So somebody brings Elijah. Elijah's just had this mountaintop experience. He's just run 30 miles. He's physically exhausted. He thinks there's this huge victory, and he's just celebrating, but he's exhausted. He's probably laying down. And then he gets this note. And the note says, may my God strike me down if by this time tomorrow you are not just like my prophets. So he gets a death threat from her. And then he runs into hiding. And he is so down. He is so down when he stops. And you know he's just physically exhausted. And he is so down that he lays down and he just is like, I just want to die. I mean, he goes from the top to the bottom. And he's like, I just don't want to live anymore. He goes, and he talks to God. He's just, I'm the only one left. I'm all by myself. He's like he's physically exhausted, and he's at the end of his rope, and he's super down and depressed, and he's just struggling. After all that, he's just struggling. He's like, what was that for? I don't even know. So here's what's really interesting about this. The first thing God does is just like, go to sleep. You know, it's funny how God knows that. Okay, you need some rest. Okay, stop talking right now. You're not even making sense. Go to sleep. So God doesn't even try to talk to him when he's tired. He doesn't try to talk. He's just like, you're asleep. Then the next thing he does, he wakes up and then he gives him food. So then he feeds him. Still doesn't talk to him. He's like taking care of his physical needs. He's exhausted. Sleep, then eat. God takes care of his physical needs. Then he gives him instructions to seek spiritual refuge. But notice he doesn't do that till he makes him sleep and rest, right? So then he gives him instructions. Go up to Mount Sinai and wait for me. I'm going to talk to you. So he wakes up there. And he's just waiting for God. And this big windstorm comes. And Elijah's like, surely he'll talk to me in this great big windstorm. Nothing. God says nothing. And then this earthquake happens and everything's going crazy, and Shirley's thinking, okay, God's talking to me in this earthquake. Silence. But then in a whisper, he just gives him some instructions. He says, I have 7,000 serving me still here, hidden. 7,000 people. And then he gives him these instructions. He's like, go anoint Hazael to the king of Amram. So that's not even one of the parts of the kingdom, but it's going to be a kingdom that comes against in judgment. Then he says, go to Jehu and anoint him the king of Israel. Well, who's the king of Israel right now? Ahab. So he's telling him, Ahab's done, man. He didn't come out and say it, but he says, go appoint this other guy, the king of Israel. So then he says, go anoint Elisha to replace you. So he realizes that, so God realizes that he served him all these years, that he's tired and he needs a companion. And so he says, go anoint Elisha. I got your back, you know? You're not alone. I'm taking care of you. You just forgot because you got really, really tired, right? And because people were threatening in your life, which would probably do it for anybody, right? So here's the main message of this whole thing, is that number one, God will take care of those who serve him. I mean, every time there's nothing, Elijah has something. And he doesn't just, it doesn't lavish upon him. He lets him wait till he has to trust him. And then he brings it in, right? He exercises his faith. Sometimes God puts us through a little bit of a test so that he can just work on our faith a little bit, like resistance training. You never get stronger if you don't lift a heavier weight, right? If we sat around and did nothing, we wouldn't get any stronger. So God pushes us a little bit and is like, do you trust me? Are you going to trust me? And that just makes us stronger. So he always takes care of his people. It doesn't mean you're going to have a perfect life, but God always provides for his people. And then it says, God loves even the sinners. So this is a really loving story, even though it sounds like harsh judgment. But here's the deal. God is sending people to these evil people to say, I am the real God. Come back to me. And that's a loving gesture. So the prophets are hated, which is so sad because they're treated so badly. But God's really saying, come back to me. Come back to me. And he's begging them to come back. And so if you serve him, You will face resistance, and people won't want to hear the truth. Okay? How many prophets had a wonderful life? Okay? Let's think of some. Can't think of any. Right? Any prophets that you know that lived in a palace? I can't think of any. So, but they had this purpose of being the mouthpiece of God, which had to have been amazing in that sense. Although people didn't like him, he knew he had this mission. He knew his place. He knew what to do. So when you are doing what God wants you to do, you will face some kind of persecution. You will. At some point, people are like, oh, you're, one of those Christians, or, oh yeah, think you're better than me, do ya? Kind of thing. Or, I don't want to hear that. I mean, probably we've all heard that. I don't want to hear that. I don't believe that. But so, people aren't going to always embrace it, but you just have to be obedient. You're not responsible for what people do with what you bring them. You're only responsible to do what God asks, right? So if they reject it, it's on them. It's not on you. Even the bad things that happen to God's people, God is using them to bring light to the lost. So when bad things happen to you, it's just God showing a light in a dark place. So sometimes the people around you are watching. And God says in, I believe it's Corinthians, you're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. They're all watching you. So when you go through hard times and you trust God, people go, wow, I guess that works for that person. Man, that must be nice to have that kind of peace and that kind of trial. And the example of that in this story is the death of that boy. Why did God even allow that boy to die? Because he wanted to show, I love you, man, and I got you, and I'm bigger than anything you're facing. I'm bigger than all of it, way bigger. Watch me do this, but you got to trust me first, right? So here's the coolest part of this whole story. If you serve the Lord, you are never alone. And it's so, even when Elijah was lays down and is like, I just want to die. And how many of us have not felt that way before at some point in our life of tragedy?
Climb aboard this train, step out of your sin. Climb aboard this train, climb aboard this train, climb aboard this train, and step out of your sin.